Ms. Wong and Professor Kellogg, you may begin. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I want to thank you for this warm introduction, and thanks to everybody who may be joining both from different parts of California and possibly also from different parts of the United States and perhaps even from other parts of the world as well. Lydia and I have been working together on the national security law since this past September. And have been following it both in the run-up to its passage in June of 2020 and up to the present in terms of its implementation. And as we document in the report, there's really no way to reconcile the core elements of the national security law with the basic law itself, both in terms of the level of autonomy that's granted to Hong Kong under the basic law structure, and in terms of the core human rights provisions of the basic law that are meant to protect the basic freedoms of free association, free expression, and free assembly, all of which, as everyone probably taking part in this meeting knows, is very much under threat. Given the passage of the national security law in June of this past year. Let me start by saying a word or two about the nature of the national security law itself, and then move on to some of the key provisions, including the criminal law provisions. Then I'll say a word or two about the threat to judicial independence posed by, in particular, Article 55 of the national security law, and maybe close with a word or two about the human rights provisions that are there in the national security law and their potential meaning, or sadly to say, lack of meaning for limiting some of the key flaws in the law itself. Now, as many of you may know, Hong Kong was granted a high degree of autonomy under the basic law when it reverted to Chinese sovereignty in 1997, and that has meant that it is supposed to have autonomous legislative, executive, and judicial authority. And I think we can see from both the passage of the national security law by the National People's Congress Standing Committee in Beijing and the new structures created under the law that all three of those elements of Hong Kong's autonomy have been deeply undermined over the past, 9 months now. Take the passage of the national security law itself. As we argue in the report, the national security law really cannot be drafted and passed by the National People's Congress Standing Committee. It is the role, we argue, of Hong Kong's Legislative Council to pass laws for Hong Kong. So in that sense, the National People's Congress Standing Committee bypassed Hong Kong's legislature and its duly elected, or in some cases selected, representatives and imposed its views on Hong Kong in particularly dramatic and far-reaching fashion. At the same time, the law creates new structures, including the Committee for Safeguarding National Security, which is a hybrid structure, including both mainland and Hong Kong officials, and the Office for Safeguarding National Security, which is a purely mainland entity. Again, if we take the view that the bulk of executive authority under the basic law is supposed to reside with the Hong Kong government, these either hybrid or wholly mainland entities performing government functions in Hong Kong is a violation of the basic law and can't really be reconciled with the promise of a high degree of autonomy under the one country, two systems framework. So that too is a problem. I'll talk in a moment about concerns about judicial independence, which also has been undermined both by Article 55 and I think, as Lydia will discuss, by the implementation of the NSL thus far. Let's look at some of the core provisions of the national security law. As probably all of you know, there are four key crimes, that are created by the national security law: that of secession, subversion, collusion with foreign actors, and terrorism. And I think you can clearly see that each of those four core provisions very much map onto key elements of the 2019 pro-democracy protests that were very much of concern to Beijing. And so in a way, it does seem that the law is structured to tackle core activities, core groups, or even specific individuals who came to the fore during the 2019 protests. Take the secession provisions, for example. On their face, they're meant to outlaw, to criminalize activity that is meant to split Hong Kong from the mainland, but they're written in such a sort of broad and vague way that they could easily be used, and we argue have been used, to crack down on pro-independent speech in Hong Kong, and with a particular focus on the use of key slogans from the 2019 protests. Another example, take the collusion provisions, for example. That's clearly, in our view, meant to crack down on efforts by Hong Kong activists to lobby U.S. government officials in Washington, officials of other governments in the United Kingdom and elsewhere in Europe, as well as actors elsewhere in the world, including at the UN and other international bodies. So we have a clear effort to target specific behaviors that Beijing found objectionable during the 2019 protests, but nonetheless, under international human rights law, should be considered protected behavior. Actually, one of the things that's surprised me, and again, Lydia will talk about this more during her presentation, is the way that they have used the national security law to go after more mainstream pro-democratic political figures who certainly played a role in the 2019 protests, but who I thought might be spared, at least initially, from such heavy scrutiny under the new national security law. And we know with the January 6 arrests and the efforts to charge the vast majority of those who were arrested on January 6 and late February, that in fact the national security law is also being used to target mainstream politicians, including former and sitting members of the Legislative Council and members of the district councils. So this is quite disturbing, because both under the basic law and under international human rights law, peaceful political activity is meant to be protected and not subject to what may be quite harsh criminal sanction. So all four of those provisions are quite worrying. And again, as Lydia will discuss in more detail, we have the effort to prosecute individuals under all four of those provisions. To give credit where credit is due, the terrorism provision is, as drafted, a bit more narrowly tailored and a bit more consistent with international and comparative best practice. That said, we argue in our report that its use thus far may not be consistent with international best practice, and does raise concern that the government is attempting to use it in ways that would violate basic human rights. Now, let me say a word or two about what I think will continue to be a key element of the national security law, both in terms of the law itself and in terms of implementation, which is Article 55 and Article 56. Which allows for the Office for Safeguarding National Security to simply take over cases that it views as meriting its special attention. And under Article 56 of the National Security Law, the OSNS has the authority to transfer individual cases back to the mainland for trial. And again, this is deeply problematic, first and foremost, because the ability for a Hong Kong activist or any activist to obtain a fair trial in a mainland Chinese court is simply non-existent. On top of that, we believe that there is a problem in terms of this provision of the law being used to either explicitly or implicitly threaten Hong Kong judges as they are attempting to rule on individual cases under the national security law. Lydia and I have both heard lawyers in Hong Kong express concerns that the central government in Beijing is going to send signals to lawyers handling these, particularly the high-profile cases under the national security law, and say to them, again, either directly or indirectly, that if you don't deliver a verdict that is consistent with our views of the case, then we will simply transfer the case back to the mainland, and then the individual's fate will be sealed and the outcome will be guaranteed. So this kind of second guessing that may start to take place in national security law cases is deeply disturbing. Now, to be clear, we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. Some of you may be aware of the kind of statements that were made in pro-Beijing media outlets during the bail hearings that took place for Hong Kong media mogul Jimmy Lai. It's unclear whether that kind of public statement, whether those public statements had any impact on the eventual decision not to grant Jimmy Lai bail, but it is deeply disturbing. The fact that you have pro-Beijing outlets signaling, we assume, Beijing's views on a particular matter, and then the outcome matching Beijing's views. And we'll have to see if that trend continues as Jimmy Lai goes to trial in the spring of this year. Now, last but not least, let me at least mention that there are basic human rights protections put into the national security law, but we believe that these provisions will not offer sufficient or really any protection to individuals being tried under the national security law. They may be, in effect, window dressing, covering over, or at least attempting to cover over some of the most concerning elements of the national security law, including the criminal provisions that I just mentioned, and the creation of the new structures which severely undercut Hong Kong's autonomy. Where do we go from here? Now, there's no easy answer to that, and I do think and hope that we'll have more time to talk about that during the Q&A. But at least let me say that I do hope and believe that the Biden administration will continue to keep both the national security law and the overall situation in Hong Kong high on its agenda with Beijing, and we've seen some positive signs on that front vis-a-vis Secretary of State Blinken's initial engagement with his Chinese counterparts, and there was an effort to raise the Hong Kong issue during the meetings in Anchorage earlier this month. So we do have a signal that the Biden administration is going to take the threat posed by the national security law seriously, and we'll just have to wait and see whether or not Beijing will, over time, start to recalibrate its approach. Having said that, I'm a bit pessimistic that we'll see any positive change anytime soon. I think at least for the next year, we're going to be seeing continued vigorous use of the national security law to crack down on Beijing's political opponents in Hong Kong. as well as other steps, including the recent reforms to the Hong Kong's election structure that will further limit the basic rights and freedoms of the people of Hong Kong. So let me leave it there and turn it over to Lydia, and then I think we'll come back for some discussion.
Okay, so I'm going to share a presentation because I'm not turning on my camera, so it's better for you guys to have something to look at, I guess. So I'm Lydia. So thank you everyone for joining this event tonight. So I'm a scholar from China. So I hope everyone can understand that I'm using a pen name basically for this report, and I'm not turning on my camera today. So I'm going to present to you like more about the implementation of their national security law, especially the legal cases. So I'm going to have an overview about their national security cases also. And then I'm going to go into a few case study to look at some of the cases more deeply. So let's get into it. Firstly, I want to make the point that actually the national security law, since it was enacted, is under very active use. So some of the maybe Western scholars have thought that before the enactment, maybe the national security law just an implicit threat, like a nuclear button that hanging there. But actually, after the enactment, we can see like the government actually is pushing the nuclear button a lot. So there are 111 arrests since the enactment of the law, and then we find that there are three main focus of this arrest. So first focus is clearly the freedom of speech, especially some more protest slogan and pro-independent slogan. So there are 12 people were arrested under the NSL or by NSL, like the National Security Law, or by the National Security Department of the Hong Kong Police, purely because of their political speech. And there are another 11 people who were arrested because of a combination of speech, political speech, and other behavior. And the second main focus of these cases is the targeting the foreign connection between Hong Kong activists or organization and foreign actor. So there are 17 cases we can identify as targeting the foreign connection. So the law is quite clearly intend to break down the connection between the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement and their international supporters. And then the third focus is the political opposition, so targeting and suppressing the political opposition in Hong Kong. So there have been 55 subversion cases, mainly happened in this year. So it's almost half of the arrests were these subversion cases. So we are going to go back to these themes later, but yeah, we are going to go through this focus later. But right now, let's also point out some alarming features that we can identify from this 111 arrests. Like one is that there's a sudden increase in charges. So before March this year, although there are 111 arrests, there are only 11 people were charged, both under NSL offense or non-NSL crimes. But like just in March this year, there have been 48 charges. So just to give a hint about this, how we interpret this sudden increase is that the NSL is clearly used as a tool that to control the political agenda or to suppress political oppositions based on the need of the government. So it's not likely using as a legal tool at this sense. And also another concerning situation is that there is a mixture of NSL and non-NSL crimes like associated with this arrest and charges, which means that there could be some severe abuse of power both by the police, national security department, and also possibly involve the designated judges, which means that because the NSL actually give the National Security Department of the Hong Kong Police very substantial and extensive authorizations for investigation as civilian. But if they also can use these things to target or involve in non-NSL cases, then there could be a severe concern of abuse of power. Also, the possible of the abuse use of designated judge. So those judges will also deal with non-NSL crime, which can lead to a more, you can say, conservative or pro-Beijing, more like doubtful judgment or ruling. So this is the overview of the case. Now we are going to move into the case studies. So the first case study I'm going to present is about the primary election case. It happened initially in January 6 this year, and it escalated in end of February or early March this year. So I'm not going to give a lot of factual detail of these cases because I think a lot of our audience today actually know about these cases. So I'm going to focus more on the political implication and analysis about these cases. But just to quickly go through the the facts, which is like 55 people were arrested under this case. 2 of them were already under custody, so plus plus 2, 53 plus 2. So Joshua Wong and Tan Tet-Chi was already under custody. And after a month, 47 of them were charged and only 11 grant bails. So an interesting detail about this case is that after the initial arrest, actually most of them were granted police bail, but like they were suddenly demanded to report to the police on February 28th, which is a month earlier than the day they're supposed to report to the police. So it's very tricky. And then after this improvised or sudden report, then 47 people were charged. So they are right now under custody. So the concerning part is that considering the events during that period, we can reasonably argue that the government was trying to take those politicians, most of these 55 people are the most prominent politicians and activists in Hong Kong. So the government was trying to take the politicians under control to guarantee the smooth announcement of the electoral reform, which was announced during the National People's Congress in March. So it's a guarantee for this political agenda. So in this case, it's an overt use of the NSL for political agenda and suppressing opposition. So this is a very troubling use of the NSL and declare the political nature of the NSL itself. And then more profoundly, actually by using NSL to charge these people and bring them under custody, the government eliminate the pro-democratic political competitors or their enemies for the coming elections this year. So this is also a very clear use for the political agenda and also more profoundly transforming the political sphere in Hong Kong. And another concerning element of this case is criminalizing the peaceful and institutionalized electoral politics. So targeting the primary election, which is is unlikely to be a crime in any liberal and democratic countries, and actually Benitai's effort to kind of have a 35 plus legal counsel for the pan-democratic camp actually is granted or protected by the basic law. So it's a highly institutionalized mechanism that he tried to trigger. So it's very concerning that actually is using the NSL to criminalize some kind of political activity and rights that is granted by the basic law. So this is the primary election case. Let's move on to the Jamie Lai case. So the initial arrest of the Jamie Lai case happened in August 10th, 2020. So it involved Jamie Lai, the media tycoon, the owner of the founder of Apple Daily, and also prominent activist Agnes Zhou, and also Andy Lee. So there are Andy Lee. So this person we are going to come back to. So there are 10 people in total, including some senior managers at Apple Daily. And in December 2020, Lai was first charged with default, which is related to the unapprovable use of a government-subsidized land. Actually, this is a very minor issue that is not used to be tackled by like any criminal charge, but the government charged Jamie Lai and also denied his bail. And a few days later, the government charged him with collusion, which mainly referred to his Twitter and media speech advocating for international support to the Andy Lee case. So, and also the 12 Hong Kong people who were bring under mainland custody because they tried to, according to pro-Beijing media, try to fly to Taiwan from Hong Kong, and Andy Lee was one of them. So Andy Lee was under Chinese custody and bring back to China for sentence for unlawful border crossing, and he spent 7 months jail time in China. So, but in regard to Jamie Lai's situation, he just advocating. So it actually is targeting the freedom of speech of him to advocate for foreign audience. And then in February 2021, the government bring another collusion charge to Jamie Lai, referred to his financial support to an overseas advocacy group, and also helping Andy Lee to fly from Hong Kong. So this case is very complex and have tons of alarming elements, including using the criminal crime to punishing political behavior, also using the NSL to target critical opponent, which is Jamie Lai, and using collusion accusation for international advocacy, and harming domestic and overseas freedom of speech. And there's also problematic practice unfolding, which is in the Andy Lee's case. So Andy Lee was returned to Hong Kong recently, but in his case is very weirdly, he was assigned to a lawyer that is kind of pro-Beijing, and his family is not speaking out anymore after he come back, and he is not speaking to the media in any way. So there's concern that maybe by using Andy Lee, who was spent a substantial time in China when we don't know what happened, maybe it's building up a case against Jamie Lai according to Beijing's narrative. And so this case is very concerning and is still unfolding. Whether it will become a very pretty and kind of Beijing case aligned with Beijing's narrative is a very concerning point that we should keep our observation. Then I'm just going to quickly go through this case study about the political expression. So actually there's multiple types of case showing that is suppressing political expression. The first type I want to mention is the cases in July 1st last year. So on the first day of NSL's enactment, people were arrested because they are wearing T-shirts and have cell phone stickers that that bearing the protest slogan. So it's very overt that the police is using the NSL to intimidate people for this kind of political expression. So most of them, so they all grant bail after initial arrest. However, so it seems like a soft suppression or soft intimidation, which means I'm not throwing you in jail directly. But however, if you continue this behavior, then we go to the second type of cases, which is the wherein the police are going to bring NSL charges against you. So in the case of Adam Ma and also Tony Chung, like his situation is that he tried to seek political asylum at the U.S. consulate, and he is also immediately bring charge against. So that is very concerning that this kind of intimidation actually can escalate into very severe like political suppression. And the third type is in the Tan Tachi case. So he was not charged by an NSL offense, but he was charged by the sedition under criminal ordinance, but is also under the big umbrella of suppressing political expression. So I don't have much time. So actually in our report, there are other aspects of our report is about the bureaucratic reform, the educational reform, the climate of fear kind of formed under the NSL. So our conclusion is that NSL is not just a bunch of creating a bunch of political cases, but it's a very substantial and comprehensive transformation of Hong Kong's society and institution that is very concerning, that turning Hong Kong as a liberal or open society into a much more closed and maybe some people will argue authoritarian kind of place. So this is our report, and we welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Wong and Professor Kellogg for the presentation and sharings on the implementation and implication of the NSL. And next, we will begin the Q&A section. I encourage you to submit your questions by sending a message to me through the chat in BlueJeans here. Perhaps we can begin with the questions submitted beforehand. The first questions we have is that, is the national security law retroactively enforced? If so, any legal theory to support or oppose this practice?
I can say a word or two about that, and Lydia may want to jump in as well. So of course, the national security law specifically states that it will not be retroactive. So we can at least have some hope that Beijing will adhere to its promise there not to do that. But as we document in the report, in some cases, the newly created national security bodies have seemed to investigate, or even in court hearings have raised specific actions that were taken before June 30th, 2020. So, for example, in the Jimmy Lai case and the investigation into his case and into Agnes Chow, you have a lot of work being done to try to suss out funding for the organization Stand With Hong Kong, and the suggestion that this organization and Jimmy Lai's alleged financial support for it, and Agnes Chow's alleged advocacy on its behalf could constitute a violation of the national security law. So that's just one example of the national security authorities taking a look at activities which should be beyond the scope of the law itself. Now, exactly what will happen as these cases move to the trial phase, we'll have to wait and see, but certainly that element of the activity of the national security authorities thus far is very concerning. Lydia, did you want to add anything on that?
I'm good. I think like you're the legal expert here, so that's great.
Hardly. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And the next questions we have is that how has passing Hong Kong national security law impacted Beijing's relationship with citizens in Hong Kong and the West, especially the US? And how do we interpret the nationalist sentiment that have been haunting the mainstream media of mainland China?
Lydia, you should go first. I took the first one, so you should go first on this one if
Yeah,
you want.
so like I try to reiterate the question. So is the question about like how that impact the relationship between like both Hong Kong citizen and for US citizen, and what is the second part of that question? Sorry.
Yeah, the first part of the question is correct, and the second part is about how do we interpret the nationalist sentiment that have been haunting the mainstream media of mainland China.
Okay, so yeah, that's very interesting. It's not directly related to the NSL, but so I'm actually answering the second question, so I'm just like kind of get it over. So which is like I think like the so I think the Chinese media kind of like have building up the nationalism among Chinese people for a while, for a couple of years, and that could be like partially the so-called basis of public opinion for Beijing passed the Hong Kong national security law. So we know that the public opinion in Hong Kong is likely to go against the passing of the national security law. Also, like I don't think like the citizens in any democratic country would think that passing the national security law in Hong Kong is like a good or democratic thing to do. But for Chinese nationals, like or for Chinese people, like because of the control of information and how the mainstream media have been presenting the 2019 protests in Hong Kong as like as kind of violent and very like a dark side of the society, those kind of things. So actually has like at least like from the surface or from what we can see, like it enjoy a high level of public support among a lot of like mainland citizens. So I think, of course, that is concerning, and of course that is like problematic in a lot of sense, and also that will heighten the split or hostility between Hong Kong citizens and mainland citizens. But I also would like to point out that that is a long-term media campaign by the Chinese government, also the official media. So I think like this is a phenomenon under like how Beijing is treating and like its Hong Kong policy. So it's a very unfortunate situation. And then in terms of how that will affect the relationship between Beijing and Hong Kong citizens and maybe foreign citizens, I think like for Hong Kong citizens, the situation is very clear that um, that both kind of like heighten or increase their discourage or discontent against Beijing, but also I think the effect of disheartening them, like creating the climate of fear is very essential. Like it basically caused the Hong Kong citizens to self-censor themselves a lot, and more of them become very disappointed and just think like kind of it creates the sentiment that like Beijing can do whatever they want and the government can do whatever they want. They can just use the national security law to do whatever they want, and they can impose on us any kind of law. So I think the effect of disheartening the Hong Kong citizens and especially the pro-democratic activists is very substantial, and it could like profoundly transform the political dynamic in Hong Kong. And in terms of foreign citizens, of course, it actually increased, I think, their disapproval or like unfavoriting Beijing for the foreign citizens, especially in democratic countries, and also it creating the public opinion base for the U.S. government and other maybe democratic governments to have more hardline policies against Beijing. Like some like people can have different opinion about this kind of phenomenon. Some people would think that it's good that like finally we can have human rights issues upfront and we can pass acts and laws maybe censoring like the Chinese officials, even Chinese business, things like that. But of course that is a deepened discord between China and Western countries, and also a lot of like nationalist Chinese citizens and the democratic governments and society. So we are in this like transformational period that we see the discourage and the split is deepening between the so-called non-liberal and liberal camp and world. So of course it's a sad phenomenon in any sense, in a lot of sense, but we like as people living in this era, maybe we can just think about like what we can do to maybe keep the human rights issue upfront, but still not creating too much a misunderstanding, and still keep our future open in terms of like communication or like the possibility of change. Thank you.
Professor Kellogg, do you have anything to add on?
No, I think that was perfect. I think that was a spot on answer, and I agree with Lydia's take on that question.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. And the next questions, and perhaps the last questions we have, is that according to the NSL, it has extraterritorial power extending its influence abroad, including the United States. And you have mentioned that the NSL impeaches Hong Kong Basic Law. Is this implication compatible with the international laws and the common practice? And what is its impact? And also, are there attempts of arrest of such individuals who advocate for Hong Kong against China abroad? Thank you.
Okay, let me take that element of it first and then loop back on the basic law and international human rights law question. So as some of you may know, Beijing has signaled that certain either current or former Hong Kong citizens are of interest to the national security authorities in Hong Kong. U.S. citizen Hong Kong U.S. citizen Samuel Zhu, who heads obviously one of the key Hong Kong advocacy organizations in the United States, and who is himself an American citizen, has been signaled out as somebody that is a person of interest for Hong Kong. So there is an effort to signal to the international community that both Beijing and the Hong Kong government want to make use of this extraterritorial provision, which is deeply disturbing. Having said that, there's obviously no chance that the U.S. government would return someone like Samuel Chu back to Hong Kong, or that they would return almost anyone to Hong Kong for trial under the national security law. So this is, in some ways, a symbolic gesture by the Hong Kong government and by Beijing to try to say to the international community, we want this person, we want that person, that kind of thing. That doesn't make it any less disturbing or any less wrong, but it does mean at the very least that people like Samuel Drew can continue doing the important work that they're doing, and not worry about any sort of extraterritorial provision being used against them, at least for the time being. Now, on the first part, in terms of the basic law and international human rights law, I think that what we're going to see over the next few months is the Hong Kong courts really struggling with these cases. They're being put in an absolutely impossible position in which they're being asked in no uncertain terms, both by the prosecutor in Hong Kong and quite clearly by Beijing, to put these people in jail for basic, protected, peaceful political activity. Right? How can you, if you have a basic law, a sort of mini constitution, as it's often called, that protects basic human rights, how can you punish people for holding a primary election? Right? That just doesn't make sense. And as probably everyone on this call knows, Hong Kong's basic law is directly linked to international human rights law. So in case there's any vagueness in terms of the key human rights provisions of the basic law, judges are not just allowed to, but encouraged to look to international human rights law for further guidance. And in that context, it's just impossible to have, again, someone be convicted for holding a primary election, or someone be convicted for having a conversation with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, whatever it is. We're sort of heading straight toward a judicial crisis, and I, for one, don't know how the courts are going to handle this. And if they do, as I hope they will, acquit all of these people, that if they do refuse to find any of them guilty, then what will Beijing's response be? So it's going to be a very difficult few months coming up in 2021, and we'll just have to wait and see how it plays out.
Yeah, thank you. And we have the very last questions, and that is, how has Europe reacted to the NSL compared to the US?
Lydia, do you want to go first?
So I think right now the situation is more like the European countries are more like following the US in some sense. So like US is the first to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and also issue sanctions against a lot of Hong Kong officials that involve in political cases. And then like the European country also issue their sanction, but to some extent, like interestingly, like so China actually react to those react to both sanctions, but I kind of get the impression that the reaction by China against the Europe sanction actually is even stronger than how it react to the U.S. sanctions. So it kind of like retaliate sanction against major European Union entities, and also some even legal firm, and that actually kind of how do I say, like irritate the European Union, and they suspend the trade the vetting process of the trade agreement between China and EU. So it's very interesting that so during the Trump administration, I would say like the US basically moving alone, like unilaterally against like some of like Chinese behavior, but like the Biden administration tried to form alliance with the European countries to kind of like resist or confront Chinese human rights abuse. And when European country follow up, then the Chinese retaliation actually kind of like pushing the European countries more to the US side. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic, and there's a lot more to observe, like how this dynamic would play out. Whether this is just a one wrong thing, or this is going to become a thing between U.S. and European politics and China politics, which means like although the European country try to hedge a little bit between China and U.S., but like a lot of like Chinese behavior is going to pushing the democratic European countries more towards U.S. Maybe they will be able to form more like stronger alliance and have more like measures to tackle or to go against Chinese human rights abuse. I hope I answered this question.
Could I add one quick point there? I know we're almost out of time, but just to follow up on Lydia's sort of excellent points. I would just say, look, I know there's been a lot of debate in various Hong Kong circles in the run-up to the 2020 U.S. election about would the Biden administration take the situation in Hong Kong as seriously as the Trump administration did. And I think we've seen, evidence, again, it's still early, but I think we have seen some evidence that the Biden administration does want to have human rights and the situation in Hong Kong in particular be a key part of their, China strategy. And what I would say is that there certainly is, building on Lydia's point, that there certainly is the possibility that the Biden administration can be more effective in terms of engagement on Hong Kong because the Biden administration is better able to work in collaboration with our European allies, with our allies in Asia, and really have more of a coordinated effort to signal to Beijing that their approach to Hong Kong is unacceptable. And I think that that's the kind of effort where you have senior Chinese officials hearing from the Europeans, from the UK, from the Americans, of course, day in and day out, that they need to have a change of approach in Hong Kong. That's when we might see some change. And I think the Biden administration is better placed to execute that kind of strategy.
Yeah, thank you. And time is running out. And thanks again, Ms. Wong and Professor Kellogg, for putting together this comprehensive report and sharing your insight with us today. Before we end the meeting, I would like to encourage you to participate in the virtual policy conference for Hong Kong hosted by HKDC, the Hong Kong Democracy Council. This conference is happening next week from April 19th to the 21st. The members of the House, Senate, and Hong Kong activists, digital security experts, and representatives from different human rights groups such as the Human Rights Watch, Uyghur Human Rights Project, and the Burma Campaign UK, and many more will be speaking at the conference. And more detail about the speakers, program, and the registration can be found on this link. I'm also going to put the link here in the chat. So join us next week as we discuss the future American policy making about Hong Kong. Last but not least, thank you everyone for joining us today, and the recording of today's presentation will be posted and sent to you soon. And this marks the end of the meeting today. Thank you so much and take care.